Whoever's near the door can yell and say, "Get on in here." Come on back now, okay? I'm going to go ahead and begin this introduction so that way I can save time for their questions and their comments, which is more important than most of the things that I have to say. Next. Oh, go ahead. You go ahead and get a picture. I'm just going to talk about you. These are my written comments, and Colonel Howard Marotto wrote them for me. So he's so tall and good looking, yeah, and smart. I said, please welcome the man who needs no introduction, because there's a solid chance that everyone in a 100-mile radius knows him and can hear him, because he's one of the loudest people you'll ever meet. Colonel Howard, we know him as Howie Marotto, United States Marine Corps. Colonel Marotto is one of the Department of Defense's foremost experts in logistics innovation and emerging sustainment technologies. He's previously served as the Marine Corps' additive manufacturing lead and as deputy commander of the 4th Marine Logistics Group, overseeing more than 8,500 Marines and sailors across the country. And I say across the country because in those positions, if you're not familiar with them, you deal with widespread humans that are not all in one location, and we all know how difficult that can be. Following or alongside his military career, he's continued to drive innovation in industry, helping organizations integrate digital manufacturing and edge repair into logistics systems. He brings decades of experience in contested sustainment, expeditionary repair, and force modernization. Please join me in a round of applause for my friend, Howie.
That's good. Thank you. Thank you, Brandon, and thank you, everyone, for still being here. Right? You always wonder in your last panel, who's going to stick around? And by the way, for those who left, totally get it, right? We all have lives, we're all busy, but I really do appreciate everyone's dedication to stay here for the panel today, and hopefully we're going to make it really interesting. It's going to be really a discussion forum. I think we have a very diverse and interesting group of folks here on the panel: industry, an ally and a partner, and a general who's now in industry as well, who's been a logistician much longer than me. And actually, when I first met him, we were in Afghanistan. He doesn't remember it, of course. I was just, a lieutenant colonel at the time, but I remember him. So it's great to be on the panel with him and get to know him. So I think we're going to really enjoy this talk today. And I think it kind of ties into what General Donovan said earlier. He was talking all about it. I think he maybe said it specifically, is the contested logistics piece. And I did hear him mention autonomy, right? So I think, it is very appropriate, today's talks. It's very appropriate to what we're talking about in the next fight. And one of the things that hit me that he was talking about, right, was the casualties, talking about the casualties. And how, there's no golden hour. And there you go. That is hard to argue with, particularly in the Pacific. But what I didn't hear him talk about, and something we've been working on a long time, is what are we talking about with autonomy to address that challenge, right? Are there autonomous systems that can go out and pick up those casualties? Are we okay with that, right? Is there a way to sustain life through autonomous systems in that movement, right? Believe it or not, most of you probably sticking around here still probably know this, but there are a lot of folks working on those problems. So anyways, with that, I think that's a good lead-in. What I'm going to do here, format, open discussion, I'm going to have each of the panelists introduce themselves, talk about where they're from, talk briefly about what they do and their thoughts on the subject, and then we'll go into a couple questions, and then we'll open it up to you all here today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our first guest, who I think maybe came the farthest for this conference. I don't know. Anybody come from farther than Japan? All right. If they did, they left anyway. So our farthest guest, Yuta Shi. I'll turn it over to you first, and then we'll go over to Austin Gray, and then General Dorman. So Yuta, over to you.
Hi, I'm Yuta, co-founder and CEO of Bulwark Dynamics, and we develop autonomous beach landing vessels that resupply Marine Corps units. And although our company is a US-based company, as he introduced, me and my co-founder are from Tokyo, Japan, and we have been running this startup only for 6 months, so keep that in your mind. And I have been running a successful commercial startups like last year, but the moment I realized our industrial base and innovation pipeline was not ready for the potential conflict with China, I shut down that startup and started this new venture, despite having no background in defense industry. So yeah, I'm here to learn from you, but I'll be grateful if I can provide some insights. And by leveraging our relationship with Japanese shipbuilding industries, we aim to mass produce unmanned vessels for the U.S. military. Of course, there's Jones Act. We have to think about that. But we see a critical gap in the ability to sustain standing forces in contested environments. So we aim to build a semi-submersible and beach-capable autonomous craft that can serve as a shore-to-shore connectors for Marines conducting EAB operation. So that's what I'm doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuta. And one thing, I think the crowd understands this, we're not going to be able to do this all alone, and having a capability forward that can produce assets for us forward, particularly in a custom logistic environment, is going to be critical. So it's an honor, Yuta, to have you, and it's an honor. I think it's great that you saw the problem and were willing to address it and be here with us today, so I appreciate that. Next, over to Austin. Austin Gray.
Thank you, Colonel. My name is Austin Gray. I'm one of the co-founders of Blue Water Autonomy. We're building mass-producible unmanned ships for the Navy and the Joint Force. I wish more for the Marine Corps. There's some sort of problems in the building that make it harder to build for the Marine Corps. Why are we doing this and how are we doing it? So 2 years ago today, I was working in a drone factory in the suburbs of Kyiv. I'd just been to the front line for the first time, and when I went out there, I noticed that everything was attritable and everything was distributed if it was inside of Russian artillery range. And the problem that we have in the Pacific is that it's not artillery range we have to worry about, it's missile range. And the missiles have thousands of miles of range, many of them, right? So we have to create platforms, vessels, aircraft, et cetera, that have favorable or not terribly unfavorable cost matchups with the adversary's cost to shoot at us. And so if the missiles cost millions of dollars, or maybe 10 mil is a sort of open source number for a ballistic missile for the higher end of it, then you need to create vessels that only cost 20 or 30 million, i.e. 2 to 3 very expensive missiles, to make it not worth shooting at you. And so at Blue Water, that's what we're doing. We've raised multiple rounds of venture capital. We're building our first full ship for the U.S. Navy right now for the MASC program. If you've seen that in the news, I've been writing the white paper all week. It's due on Monday. And we're excited, I think, about the passionate, problem space in the Marine Corps and the Army especially, because there's this huge, huge gap in the force architecture of getting something that can move around, the front lines of the Western Pacific with the range, speed, and mission profile, and by carrying a lot of stuff, right? So this can't be a speedboat. There are a lot of great speedboat companies out there. We're not one of them. I wish them good fortune. We're building ships because we got to move a lot of stuff in order to make a dent in the contested logistics problem.
Yeah, thank you, Austin. I think it's interesting. Aaron Angel and I have had some sidebar conversations about the Marine Corps and ships. And if you want some really good insight, grab Aaron after. Sorry, Aaron, I just volunteered you, but an expert on it and the challenges we're having, struggling with that construct that you mentioned, Austin. Like, are we going to buy ships? Are we not going to buy ships? Who's going to operate those ships? The autonomous answer helps a little bit with that, anyways. But I know we've been focused on the Indo-PACOM environment, but these technologies are going to apply everywhere, right? We don't get to pick the next war. We don't get to pick where we fight it. But I think most of us in this crowd know, and if you don't, that the majority of the population of the world lives within about 100 to 300 miles of the shore everywhere. So if it's going to be a fight, there's going to be a littoral aspect to it. And these technologies, I think, will be critical. And I love your perspective too, Austin. Hey, there's a purpose and a time and a place for speedboats, but logistics probably isn't one of them, right? So I appreciate your common sense perspective and your insight coming from Kyiv and the forward operating areas in Ukraine as well. I think that'll pay dividends in the future. So good to have you here. And last but certainly not least, I put General Dorman in the cleanup spot for us. Over to you, sir.
Thanks, Howie. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be back at GELS. Been here the last several years, and I really admire how you approach expeditionary logistics, since we're no longer an expeditionary nation and an expeditionary force. We have to return to that. So I'm a 38-and-a-half-year Army veteran, started as an enlisted guy, as an operator, into my majority as an operator, special operator, and then I became a logistician. So I grew up and put away childish things and thought about the really difficult problem sets that exist out there. And, you know, I did conventional, unconventional the rest of my time, and Europe, CENTCOM, repeat offender like most of you, and out in the Pacific, not only in Holo Peninsula down there in JTF 510, helping the Catholic government defeat a Salafist insurgency that without killing a lot of people, and using a lot of watercraft of different types, right? And then the senior sustainer in the Pacific, and then retiring back out of CENTCOM in my last job countering ISIS. Since retiring, I've worked at the Institute for Defense Analysis doing modernization transformation, thinking about problem sets like this in places like Lebanon and really difficult places. I've also taken on a job as the senior advisor to the DoD Irregular Warfare Center. In that role, I'm the senior advisor for global sustainment, contested logistics, and something we're building out called offensive supply chain operations, because we're so eager to look for the fight that we want to fight, right? So we're going to have to fight to get to the fight. Then we're going to have to fight the fight the enemy wants us to fight. Then we can fight our fight. But we're so anxious to go look for the fight in the crisis and conflict part of the continuum that we're missing the fight we're in the competition continuum. And that is where the maneuver space is the supply chain and the global hyper-connected supply chain environment in which we live. That is the maneuver space. That's where we have to be using new technologies and thinking about them in a new way. And so that's my other job is offensive supply chain operations. So our maneuverist and should be out there, instead of doing a JSET teaching how to do basic rifle marksmanship, which might be important, is how do we understand the networks and industrial capacity that's out there, and we can dial them up or down to create problems for our adversaries in their own supply chains, because we're all interlinked. And so doing that, I'm a partner in S10 Consulting, so we're trying to help small businesses penetrate the space in, you know, places like the DIU blue list, which is almost impossible to get past. And we'll talk about that later, and really talk about something that General Donovan talked about. We should be a joint force, right? We're individual services, but we make up a joint force. So culture is killing us on things like designing autonomous capability, especially ships. And in that last one, General Whaley had asked me a while back to take on something that we call the Army Littoral Maneuvering and Sustainment Advocacy Group. So we work with businesses that do those types of things to talk to our congressional representatives and their staffers in person to get language into the NDIA, because that's the only way we're going to be successful. We're going to have to drive it from the appropriation side of Congress and them embarrassing the service chiefs on saying, you're a great warfighting guy at the edge, but you don't know how to run a large institution and have the required enabling capabilities to do what we need to do to be successful for credible deterrence. It's not necessarily about winning and putting a boot on somebody's neck. It's about credible deterrence, right? And so if we can do that, so thank you very much.
Yes, sir. There was a lot of great meat there, sir. And it's interesting with Lieutenant General Donovan talking earlier. You know, I heard a lot about what you were saying. It's, you know, there's a lot of leaders out there with the big grand ideas, but then again, not necessarily understanding the solutions. I think that's one point you brought up. Offensive logistics, that was really a theme last year of GELS, sir, which of course you contributed to, and I like that. I haven't heard that a lot. Of course, I've been in and out a lot, so forgive me if it's been said, but the idea of offensive logistics. And then since getting to know you and working with you, sir, one thing that I've learned about you, and it's been helpful to me as a logistician and leader, is that looking at the logistics space holistically all the way back to the mine, all the way back to the factory, which we often don't do in uniform. But to your point, that's really where we need to be competing now. in that competition continuum. And kind of back to your point, Austin, how do we use that to create a cost-imposing strategy on our adversary? How do we make it not worth firing those missiles? How do we make it harder for them to make those missiles? And putting them on the horns of a dilemma, just like we are on all the time when we're fighting the Houthis, for example. I mean, hey, it's great that we're, destroying some Houthi ammunition depot, but if we had to spend, total operationally $100 million to destroy 10 million of theirs, who's really winning in the end potentially? So I think appreciate your holistic view, sir, and I think that'll tie right back into my next question to you all on the panel, which is, and I mean it's right in the title, and I think we're all here because we see opportunities for autonomy in logistics and in support of operational forces and operations. But I'd like to get each of the panelists' perspective where they see the opportunity space. And again, I think Yuta will start with you because you're new to the space. You saw the opportunity. What motivated you, and what was the opportunity from your perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would rather call demand rather than opportunity, because in a Taiwan crisis context, there are two main reasons that unmanned system are or should be in high demand. And the first, not many platforms can do the job inside China's missile envelope, as Austin said. And second, these systems create a stronger deterrence against the PLA. So initially, as I said, I had no knowledge about defense industry, and so I emailed a bunch of defense experts in prominent universities in Japan, and went to ask them what's the best deterrence capability that Japan or US has to have, and the answer was cruise missiles to sink China's vessels, but it takes a lot to develop missiles, right? So we came to a conclusion to build some attritable, combat capabilities, and that's why we initially tried to, build speedboat, which Austin doesn't really like.
They're very important. We have good ones already.
Yeah.
Is what's going on.
But there's, competitive, a lot of competition going on in that speedboat market. So that's why we shifted to logistics, which, as you all understand, is critical. So did I answer your question?
Yeah, you did, Yuta. Thank you. And I do appreciate that coming at it from a new perspective, a new set of eyes. It actually is refreshing because, General Dorman's been doing this for 38 years, although super refreshing and innovative, unlike a lot of folks who've been in for 38 years. Myself, 32 years, I have my perspective and biases. It's good to have someone like yourself, Yuta, looking at it from a wholly, I would say, uncorrupted perspective and coming to some of the same conclusions. It actually makes me feel a little bit better about some of the things I think, the fact that you have that opinion and came to that conclusion, even after the experts told you cruise missiles. You're like, okay, but how does that really make sense in the long fight? So I appreciate you even taking a bit of a different perspective than what the experts told you to come into this space. So I appreciate that. And so, yeah, over to you, Austin. Same question. And I love your operational perspective from Ukraine, because while a lot of us read a lot, see, and are trying to learn a lot from there, you went over there firsthand and saw it. And I'm curious, based on what you saw, how that informed your decision to do what you're doing at Blue Water Autonomy.
Yeah, that's a good question, Howie. So I think I went through the beginning of it, right? Of I went to the line, everything's attritable. And what I didn't tell you is that before I was doing that, I was in the Navy as an intelligence officer, active duty. And the coolest project I ever got to do was I got to write a top secret white paper for my carrier strike group commander saying, this is how the Chinese will target us. And I'm obviously not going to, say anything about what was in the white paper, but the answer, which is public, is that they can see us in a bunch of different ways, right? And so I had a pretty good idea of what does it look like from the adversary's side. And I think like how I was saying to Yuta, approaching a new problem like that with fresh eyes, but a sort of broader perspective. Intel officers, we have no clue about Blue capabilities a lot of the time. No clue about Blue supply lines and supply chains, or about how we build new ships or anything like that. But we could go find the Chinese logistics node in about 5 minutes, and say here's the spot we need to hit, and here's when we need to hit it. So it's just a totally different perspective, and I think that informed, hey, that's where we as Blue are going to have major gaps and major vulnerabilities, because Red has set themselves up to target our large expensive ships, and so if we rely on large expensive ships, they're gonna hit those, because they got really upset about our large expensive ships in the 90s, and they spent 20 years building missiles that were designed to take them out and to hit airfields probably too. So I think that's sort of that's the core of it right up front.
Yeah, looking at it from a threat-based environment, right? I like that perspective, and it's interesting, and some of you in the crowd will know that maybe the most innovative logistician I ever met was an intel officer, Chris Wood. So for those of you who know Chris Wood, Chris co-founded, if you will, Next Generation Logistics with me as an intel officer, because he was looking at logistics from an entirely different perspective and understanding the vulnerabilities and the risks, and then how do we develop those capabilities to address those risks. So I think it's great to have an intel officer, again, helping us develop logistics capabilities. It takes a village, and sometimes we forget that, right? Sometimes we forget that we're logistics experts. It's what we do. We know everything. Yeah, we know a lot, but there's a lot of other people who know logistics too, and our adversaries know it, as you pointed out, Austin, and they know to target it, which I think is going a good segue into you, sir, when you talk about the offensive logistics. And so what are the opportunities from your perspective for autonomy in a contested logistics environment to not only sustain the force, but potentially even conduct offensive logistics, if you will, sir?
Okay, thanks. So contested logistics, a little bit about that first, right? I see it as, autonomy offers promise, but only if it's guided by a clear strategy, grounded in logistics realities, and scaled through a coherent, joint, combined, interagency, intergovernmental, and commercial, right, whole of society doctrine, right? Industrial support and operational planning and iteration. If you can't do that, right, if you can't have a strategy up front, then we can't innovate at speed, we can't scale at speed, we can't do the things we need to really do. But there's a part of autonomy through using AI, ML, in terms of a agentive aspect, that's autonomous as well, to get after the problem of contested logistics. Why do we have contested logistics? Because it's about kill chains. There's a blue kill chain and there's a red kill chain, right? And you have to do an assessment of each. And the longer the kill chain, the more its vulnerabilities and its gaps, right? And that's really what you want to exploit. Now, we understand our blue kill chain. I think we do. We understand it. Do we agree because of our cultures in the intel community and the operations community? The operations community understanding is, go get me some more of that. That's what we're going to do, right? But we haven't mapped it in a way that allows us to truly understand our own vulnerabilities. More importantly, we haven't mapped our adversaries. Now, we need to understand the PRC. Let's use them as an example. Have we used autonomous AI and ML and capabilities like that to really map their counter blue logistics actions? No. Thus, contested logistics, right? Because we don't understand really what they're going to do. We think we're going to understand how they supply themselves. We think we understand, hey, they're going to strike these ports and so forth. But they're actually striking us in the competition space through the supply chain today to prevent our ability to ever get to conflict, right? And so if we don't understand how they're degrading our supply chains through autonomy, which is different than we're talking about here, manned and unmanned systems, right? That's the first point. So we can't even get our head around the strategy. So there's an opportunity there to do better assessments and map their counter logistics, and that will understand how we affect our commercial shipyards, our supply chains that provide parts, where we need to position to be able to build and manufacture, and change policies and laws that say, hey, based on Jones Act, we have to build it in the States, right? Well, allies and partners, we ought to build it forward. We're doing some of that now when we build portions of ships, send them to Philadelphia to be put back together. That's a concept we're doing now. Or when we're building like Ice Pack, right, where we're working with Norway and Canada and the U.S. to build icebreakers at speed, because we're going to need a common craft that has some technical capability that can do manned, unmanned, leader follower, and other things in order to navigate where it's got to go. So first you got to have a strategy and understand the mission set, and then you got to be able to scale. So have a strategy, then you got to talk about sustaining the autonomy, because without the autonomous sustainment strategy, you can't really get to where you need to go. So I hope that answers how opportunity.
Yeah, it does, sir, and it really leads into something that has been a challenge for many of us in uniform over the years, is understanding holistically, how do we even get to build those systems, autonomous or not? And I had an interesting conversation at CDNI maybe a year and a half ago. I had a Marine major standing up talking about the requirement for amphibs, which, by the way, hasn't changed since I first started looking at that as a staff officer in 2008, 2009. It's 34, but we could make 31, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I asked the major a question, and I didn't mean to put him on the spot. It really wasn't, his fault. But I was like, based on the current demand for ships for the Navy, aircraft carriers, submarines, and everything else, and the production capacity of the shipyards of the United States, do you think that even if the Navy was interested in funding those ships, could the American industrial base make them? And his answer was, that's not my problem, sir. I'm like, no, it's exactly your problem, Major. And I said, it's all of our problem, because when we make these plans in vacuums, right, and we don't think about the industrial base, then the plan is completely unrealistic before it even goes out to be executed. And so when you talk about this with autonomy, and I'm sure, and this is going to lead into my next question to each of you, we talk about supply chain challenges and how autonomy is going to address it in contested logistics, but there's also a supply chain for autonomous systems. So I think I'll turn that back over to you all, again, starting with you, Yuta. From your perspective, just getting in, what is going to be your biggest supply chain challenge to develop that autonomous system? And then we'll go back over to you, Austin, and back to you, General Dorman. So, Yuta.
Okay, so unmanned system matters most because of the mass they provide, and of course, each unit is cheaper, and that's important, and they spare human lives, and that's important. And autonomy stack is like AI native, which sounds fancy, and it's important. But the real point is that they multiply the number of variable targets China have to hit. So even if you have a handful numbers like fancy unmanned autonomous assets, it doesn't guarantee anything, right? You have to have mass producible industrial base which can effectively deter China. So in terms of supply chain, of course we are relying semiconductor in Taiwan and maybe even China, because I just built prototype 3 feet long prototype, which is like a toy, and most of the parts I purchased from Alibaba or something, to be honest. But that's a prototype, so that doesn't really matter. But how are we going to build this in China-free with China-free components? So yeah, of course, you want to build everything in the US, Buy America or something. But we have to leverage capabilities of allies and even non-allied countries' capability. Otherwise, you can't build anything that can be mass producible.
Yeah, Yuta, that's a brilliant point. And it's kind of why I asked it. It'll lead into another question here in a bit. But I think, it's interesting when somebody mentioned the blue list earlier and how challenging that's been, right? And it's because a lot of components for drones just aren't made in the US. And some of them are made in Japan. But then we have challenges even acquiring those, and then the rest are pretty much made in China. So I appreciate your honesty as well, Yuta, and that was kind of what I was hoping to get at. So yeah, so same question over to you, Austin. As you're developing this capability, what are your biggest supply chain challenges?
So we started off very, very scared of the supply chain, Hallie. So we knew there would be a lot of problems, right? If we wanted to go build an amphib, for example, in the U.S., well, there'd be nowhere to go build an amphib, and there'd be no way to buy any of the core major components that would go into an amphib, because they're all purchased already, and they're all made bespoke on custom order 2 to 5 years in advance for the one shipyard that's making amphibs for the one customer, who's that same guy over in N95.
Right.
And we started from a point of fear, and we started by going into hey, let's design for manufacturing, right? What is the U.S. already good at building? My CTO, one of my co-founders, a long time ago, he built the first Roomba, the autonomous vacuum cleaner that's in some of your homes. I didn't have one until I met him, but now I have one, and I swear it's great. The Roomba is a very small piece of consumer electronics. Most of the parts that are in our iPhones could build a Roomba, and then you just add some structural stuff around it, right? And maybe a motor or two. But anything bigger than if you go up the size chain, anything bigger than a car, it starts to get really crazy. And if you go into like a heavy car or heavy automotive, which is what I was working on in Ukraine in the factory a bit, there's only going to be 2 suppliers in the entire West for whatever part you want. Maybe there's a third if there's one in Europe and one in North America and one in Japan or Korea, and that's if we're lucky. If you go up to the size of a ship, there's like one, max per continent. There's probably one period if it's at all a complex part, because it's all custom ordered. And so we kind of backed into how do we build and not have that problem. There are 40-ish shipyards in the United States that can build a 100 to 200 foot long steel vessel with a simple displacement hull. We're going to be building our prototype at one of those. We'll announce that soon. There are probably 10 other ones that we like that could go and scale a fleet of these vessels. And they could be ours or somebody else's, right? Could be like the Liberty ships of the 21st century. The fact that they're unmanned is it's nice, right? That there aren't people on there, so you don't have to risk people's lives. It makes them smaller, which means they fit into those yards because you don't need to have life support, and then you don't need the extra people because you end up, there's no one person on a ship or 2 people on a ship. The lowest number you can have is 16 if you go and look at this or how the Navy thinks about it once you add in cooks and mechanics and things like that. And so to keep the average vessel size down, you need to not have people on there. And that allows you to not only build in any of those shipyards and have competition between them for their labor rates, all their other rates, spread the labor pools out, right, and not concentrate your need for welders in one place like we do for all of our other ships, but to work with supply chains that overlap with, let's say, heavy automotive and overlap with the trucking industry. So maybe for Yuta's vessel, which I think we were just talking about, he can keep it small enough that he could have the same engine that goes on a truck. And then if you are there, well, guess what? That production line produces 10,000 of those engines a year. And so if you tell them, hey, we're gonna order 100 of those engines this year, they're like, great, that's a 1% increase. We can handle that. You know, every business can handle a 1% increase. But if you do the same thing with the amphib size engine, which is almost the size of this room, they're going to say it's going to be 3 years before we can deliver that. So we're designed for manufacturing. To answer your question, my biggest issue in the supply chain are going to be the long lead time items, which for us have to be the propellers that are unique to our vessel size, and then maybe some of the heavy duty electronics to move like multiple megawatts of power at once.
Yeah.
But we have to have some specialty equipment on there, and we sort of picked our poison and tried to not have 10 things like that, but only 2 things. And then we're going to go lean on those guys big time, maybe spend a little bit of extra money to trade that for risk and time.
I think that's brilliant, Austin. You said a couple of things that really hit home for me. One, on the props, I know some people 3D printing them, so maybe we should talk about that later. But yeah, and then regarding the yards in Louisiana. So my day job, I work with the Maritime Industrial Base Office, and it's interesting. I proposed that we go to the yards in Louisiana, and thankfully the Navy was like, there are yards in Louisiana, and yeah, you should go see them, right? And it was funny, to your point, Austin, I went down there and I have some good connections down there in that area. And we went to the yards, and what I determined is exactly what you determined. There is no shortage of capability or potential capacity down there. When you ask those yard owners, many of those yard owners are great. I love them because they grew up in the yards, right? These guys actually built ships by themselves, and now they're running these yards. And they'll tell you, yeah, workforce, it's a challenge, but it's not a big one for us. They'll tell you, yep, we can pump out a lot of ships a year. We just need real demand. Kind of back to your point about Liberty boats. You know, in World War II, it was just demand. And once that demand signal hit, some guy named Henry Kaiser, hopefully most of you in the room know who he is, Freedom's Forge, if you haven't read it, mandatory reading before next year. Never built a ship in his life, but he knew how to build things, right? And so he knew how to scale things. And so again, these guys know how to build ships down in the Gulf, and they can build them, but you're right, they're not gonna build amphibs. They're gonna build smaller ships, but their autonomy can help us get after that. I think that's a great point. I love how you also approached it, Austin, with beginning with the end in mind, looking at the supply chain from the beginning and building your vessel with that in mind and manufacturing in mind. You'll get the capability, but how do I build that capability in a way that I can scale it? And I love that approach. And that's not the way we've approached shipbuilding, at least not since World War II anyway. So I appreciate that. And I think that kind of brings us to something that, again, General Dorman and I were talking about, and he touched on in his comments previously. But one thing we always talk about, the opportunity and how awesome this technology is and how it's going to solve all of our problems and it's going to just make us undefeatable. But there are always risks. And sometimes I think we get enamored with the capability and gloss over the risks of one, getting to that capability, and two, even once we use it, what are the risks that we have to consider then? It's not a panacea. So, sir, turn it over to you to maybe discuss a little bit more in depth, or maybe from a different perspective, what you see as the risks of using autonomy for contested logistics.
Okay, thanks. I tend to see the risk is more pronounced than the hyperbole of the current bent of inclination leads us to suggest, right? Unmanned systems face major scaling, industrial, strategic, and investment shortfalls, right? Because we don't have a strategy that drives the mission. Because you're going to have to develop a number of different types of autonomous systems, both aviation, maritime, medical. There's medical autonomy that needs to be developed for austere locations to keep people alive longer and things like that, right? And we're facing these scaling, manufacturing. I mean, Ukraine uses 200,000 drones a month. We can't manufacture a fraction of that, right? Our industrial base is fragile and dependent. And so some of the risk I hear is, oh, we got to watch out for Chinese components and stuff. And I'd say, who cares? Buy as much of the stuff that is non-essential and buy it all up. Take it out of their supply chain, right? Because they're going to need it too, because they're developing things. Again, we're in a hyper-connected global supply chain environment. But the key things that we need, circuit boards, I was glad to see the last panel talking about, hey, we're repairing circuit boards. We're doing a lot of innovative stuff that's saving us money. So we can reduce risk if we understand and we have a strategy. The same strategy is, where do we build what autonomy for what system, and can we integrate aviation and maritime, right? Because they're going to have to work together. And we're going to have to think about how it unloads when it gets there and how we do BDAR, because arms are going to fail that you need to unload and then reload so it can return if it returns. I mean, yes, it needs to be attritable, like a round that I expend, right? And but we're not. So those are some of the risks I see currently beyond. So the hardware, chips, circuit boards, we need to control that, right? We can produce that. We can innovate at a rate like nobody else. The Chinese can't compete with us. Nobody else can. We can also push development and manufacturing to other sources. I mean, look at Amazon, Walmart. I was having this discussion with John Boyer yesterday. I mean, that is a demand-centric manufacturing mecca in the commercial sector that owns all the data about what's made where in the world. We can shift that away from China if we want to. So there's both opportunity and risk in that too, right? Because we may escalate things, and so that will have a backfiring effect on us. So we kind of have to think about it. But again, what is the strategy? Have a strategy, and then we can map the shipyards, because there's small, medium, and large shipyards, right? They can each produce something. Map it to through autonomy and AI to understand your suppliers so that they can get the distribution to it, and you have the raw materials to do the things you need to do. And then I've got to have the strategy, because the Army, in its infinite wisdom, built something called the Multi-Domain Task Force around mid-range capability missiles and air missile defense, but an LCU can't move one. And the things that we will need to move in a task organized fashion, right? So we have a maneuver support vessel light as well. It takes like 42 of them to move a brigade combat team. That's unrealistic, right? And then I hear risks that come from the mouths of leaders who have never been in the Pacific. Well, we're going to build the Higgins boat 2.0, and it's going to go 1,000 miles with 100,000 tons.
Yeah, 34 knots.
34 knots,
that,
and I said, no, it's not. It will go 540 miles one way, and and now it's got to come back, right? And there's sea states, and there's things that push against you, so it's going to run out of gas before it gets there, if it gets there, right? And again, those are the risks that I see. I think we can mitigate some of them, but if we don't have a sound strategy and we're not looking at it holistically and leveraging our commercial innovators, we're going to fail.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I just visited the multi-domain task force last week in INDOPACOM, sir. And it was interesting. I mean, I think the concept's interesting, but again, they're still wrapping their head, to your point, sir, about what is the strategy? How do we employ an MDTF? And
we're going to fly it, not in the first island chain, you're not.
Right, exactly, sir. So I think, and that's a great point as we talk about autonomy and because of logistics, I think you make about strategy, sir, and that leads to resourcing as well. We don't have a joint strategy. Everybody's coming up with their own plan, whether it's, unmanned aviation logistics, with the exception of one system, the JTAR or TrueAS systems, if you're tracking that, which crazily started back in 2015, is now just becoming a program record here a decade later. But we don't look at it jointly. We don't leverage each other's innovation. We don't leverage our partners and allies' innovation. Often, I think we have this mentality in the United States where, we are the only ones who can make really cool stuff that works, right? And our stuff is the best. And if you look around, Ukraine proves it, I think, in a lot of ways, but in other ways too. If you look at the shipyards in Korea, I mean, they can mass produce ships, large ships. We need to look at leveraging our partners and allies as well, and have to your point, sir, a unified strategy. Not everybody has to do everything the same in the DoD or with our partners and allies, but I think a unified strategy makes a lot of sense. So, but as we look at that, you said something else, and this might be a little bit off for each of the speakers, but you have to think beyond your system itself. But you mentioned something about a portfolio, sir. It has to be a portfolio of systems. Something we talked about a long time ago in NextLog. I don't need just a Group 1 UAS for logistics. I need a Group 1 through 5.
Right.
That's for air. We're probably going to need something similar on the surface/subsurface if we're talking semi-submersibles. So I think with that, going along those lines.
Well, think about it from
Yes,
an
sir.
ISR perspective, where we had different types of ISR for different missions, and we layered it, right? And it was interoperable. That's kind of how we have to think about it.
Interoperable unmanned or autonomous logistics. And I think so I know you're focusing on, the smaller, but again, logistics vessels, but what else do you see that's necessary in the space? With you coming in with a new perspective, how would you build out this autonomous portfolio of systems? What are your thoughts?
I mean, I don't have a clear answer, to be honest. Does your question mean like in terms of to support logistics?
Yeah.
Or in general?
No, I think if you have your system which you're developing, what other systems would you potentially develop in addition?
Right now, as I said, we are trying to, build vessels which support resupply mission of U.S. Marine Corps. But of course, vessels are required by the Navy and Army and self-defense force as well. So we are doing this because there's a gap to be filled, and nobody's in the unmanned surface vessel industry is looking at retool logistics. So that's why we are doing this. Of course, when we move to the phase where we have to mass produce those vessels for the Navy to the ISR or combat mission, of course we have to get prepared to, as a startup like us, we have to get prepared to mass produce for the various missions.
Yeah, and I think I understand where you're coming from. You have to focus on one system because that's what you're built to do, and you don't want to dilute, I think, your focus, which makes a lot of sense. So yeah, totally, that's a good answer, and it's a fair answer because I think a lot of times we ask our manufacturers, one thing I heard a lot at the shipyards was we keep changing the requirements on our shipbuilders. So we ask them initially for this, and then we change it, and then we change it, and then we change it, and we change it, and change it again. So I think it's a valid point. we need to ask those of people we ask to manufacture to build what it is we ask them to build. And if we need something else, maybe we ask somebody else. Unless the shipbuilder, and I'm going to go over to you, Austin. Unless the shipbuilder's already kind of planned for that modular approach, which could be another way to approach it. So I think along those lines, from your perspective, Austin, how are you looking at just one system? Are you looking at a portfolio? And if you were just to build a portfolio, what would that look like?
Yes, it's a great perspective. So if I look at the news this week, the Australians did something that the U.S. Navy was far too, habitual to even try. They bought a frigate that a Japanese company has already made, and they just bought the existing design and said, hey, go make more of these because they work, right? And they said, hey, we have a gap in our force architecture for something that looks roughly frigate sized. Let's go buy some frigates. The U.S., over 5 years ago, I'm losing track, decided to buy an Italian design and then change 80% of it. They still haven't laid down the first frigate. If we look at what, McWill, and I think one of our leaders is here in the room, was thinking about, 2-3 years ago, right when I was in Ukraine getting really worried about contested logistics, they were like, hey, we have a gap that's sort of in this, this size of, hey, can we move 2 missiles about 1,000 miles on the water, very cheaply? And then guess what? We get some experimentation with ALPV, and that's really interesting because there is a clear gap there. And there's probably a bunch of other gaps in that area too. So you want to say, hey, let's go find, and maybe if you're the 2-star in charge of logistics in Hawaii for the Army, I bet you have 4 or 5, I bet you General Gardner right now has 4 or 5 different, really big problems, of which he'd probably put down some of his personal political, buy-in or cash to solve the top 2 or 3 if a good idea was presented. And you can take that approach that McWill took with ALPV, build one for cheap, experiment, get it up to an 80% solution, and then iterate and make it better. So for Blue Water, we're lucky that most startups have to make something up and then convince the government to buy it. There is a program, the Navy's doing for medium unmanned ships, but we're talking to a lot of Army and Marine Corps, end users, requirement setters. When Aaron was in his seat a year ago, I talked to him and said, hey, what might you guys need one day, and where will the puck be? And if we were to skate there, how fast should we skate, and at what approach angle, right? And I think that we need, the best thing I would go build if I was going at one thing would be, I'd build a ship that could move a single HIMARS or a single Patriot, not a full battery, but a couple, like a large chunk of a very heavy vehicle battery, because it took 71 flights of our best logistics aircraft to get a single Patriot battery from the Middle East, or from PACOM to the Middle East, which is a whole different problem that we're going that way. But we need to optimize so that we have just the right size logistics platforms to carry our actual units efficiently. And if you do that, then you probably have your big amphibs left that actually can carry a full brigade combat team or something of a larger size of humans, because they're optimized for humans, and we can move the the vehicles and the ammo and other stuff in smaller packets and have them really distributed, and the adversary won't know where they are.
Well, what does distributed and disaggregated look like by each force and its task organization? That's the key thing, right? And then you can begin to talk to some experts like you're talking about. So as the ATSE commander and with Skip O'Neill, the J4 at the time, we said, hey, let's develop a quarterly war game tabletop series to look at contested logistics. This was back 14 to 16, 17, and bring in the experts, because they're all operating in this environment now. So they'll know more about how we should build the requirement, what will work and what won't work, than we do, because we're not in that business really. So perhaps we get the experts back in and we start doing that more often. We kit them up with their clearances. I'm talking to some of them and saying, hey, you've got some information now, so you can help us say, hey, this exists, go buy some of it, and you can buy it from a number of people. The risk there, I think, with all autonomy, is you kind of have to think about it. And I was just talking with Austin in March. I went back from my 4th trip to the Ukraine. We were a little far forward, looking at autonomy for Kazovac, right? Now, we saw yesterday, if you saw the article on the Ukrainians saved a guy who was all of his squad had been wiped out. He's got a bum leg. He's in a bunker. So they moved a motorized bicycle by aviation drone out and dropped it, and he was able to get on it. And they tried to work different systems to keep the Russians at bay, and they kept bombing him, and finally it blew him off, but then he limped in and they got him. And so there's some opportunity there, but it goes back to what we have to think about with all autonomy, right? It has to be protected, coordinated, and commanded, right? So when I was in Ukraine, they were testing some ground CASEVAC systems, right? They thought they had them protected and so forth. But I think it was not as well planned as it could have been and executed as well as it could have been. So if you don't have a defined protection posture, no sound C2, no maneuver coordination, what's the result? The patient platform will be schwacked. That's a technical term for destroyed. And I saw we had put a young man on there about 700 meters from us that got schwacked by ISR, FPV, and strike drones, right? So they have a portfolio of different types of capability and autonomy to do different things. Unfortunately, for ground systems in a place like the Ukraine, depending on the terrain, it's really going to take a lot to kind of help spoof those or do something. Again, so maybe we need to be able to swarm those, and you don't know which one you're striking that has the patient on there. So it's not about sustainment. It's about synchronization across the warfighting functions. We got to go back to that as professionals. Protection against fires, jamming, loitering. C2, who's controlling the bot, movement and maneuver, how it gets to the point of need and back, and then intels and fires, right? Enabling and conducting whatever mission you're doing. So technology without strategy, doctrine, training, and integration won't help us.
Yeah, sir. And that was brilliant. You said something which I was literally.
What happened? I blacked out. I'm sorry.
Sorry, sir. No, it was brilliant, sir. And you said something which I was actually leading right into my next question, which I was.
Wait, I need to record that for my wife.
Yeah. Yes, sir. I can repeat it if you need me to, at least once. It only costs $5. So you said something which we don't often discuss, but you mentioned offensive logistics earlier. And maybe, Austin, I'll turn over to you. We got just a few minutes left, and I want to open it up to the crowd to ask questions. But, autonomous logistics for deception, right? You mentioned it there, sir. Something I was thinking about a long time ago. We did a demonstration with Zipline out in California at 400 Liggett. And one of the scenarios we gave them was, I want you to send a bunch of drones here and then one drone over here, right? Because pretty soon the adversary is going to pick up on those TTPs, right? So Austin, Intel guy, autonomous guy, have you looked at, how you might do autonomous logistics for deception?
100%. I think that is something that N2 and 6 and related organizations in the building are thinking about a lot. It's a tough conversation to have out here in the open.
Yeah, you use the word deception, and it's difficult to even go beyond that.
Yeah, but they talk about ISR related payloads that can be carried by unmanned vessels, and at the end of the day, the goal of any platform in the military is to move a payload, right? Mm-hmm. And so if your payload is, whether it's an emitter that is there to bounce that signal off something and hear it, or it's there to emit that signal so that the adversary hears it, or if it's there to just use a sensor that's passive and doesn't have any signal, but can take a photo or get you back some RF data or some acoustic data, then that's the platform's there to do. And if we're doing something like deception, then there's really no reason to have humans involved, on the platform locally, because you can probably, create that effect from a much smaller platform because the payload doesn't need to be that big.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. The other thing you said, and then I'm going to turn it over to the group for questions, was something I brought up when we were, again, talking to Zipline. You always have to worry about swap, size, weight, and performance, right, and cost. But one of the things that I talked about was passive collection while you're doing a logistics mission. Because as we discussed earlier, this contested logistic environment, and I've had other sidebar discussions, we might own this position and this position, but we don't own anything in between. And so being able to do collection as you're doing logistics also is a very intriguing concept, and using autonomy to do that. And with our new tools, with AI, with being able to collect massive amounts of data and screen it over without a human being, I think leads to great potential for logistics to be multi-purpose platforms without diluting the fact that they're logistics platforms, which is always a concern as a logistician. So just a nice little thought to end with before we open it up to questions. So I think we have a few minutes left. Happy for some people's thoughts or questions, yeah.
Great discussion. Simple question. Portfolios work because of systems. And companies are vertically integrated because they will be able to manage those systems over a life cycle. The question to the group is, have you seen anywhere where systems engineering is well managed in an open community? In other words, I don't own everything in my integration. Everybody wants a platform. You want to bring a capability up. It's not a platform yet. It's a growing capability. But you actually need to have that full end-to-end system thought. And when you have a rapidly changing supply chain community, et cetera, like where are the places where, you know, good stakeholder analysis requirements, your V&V, all that sort of systems engineering work is done in an open context?
Any engineers?
So you're talking about, am I using digital engineering that's in an open system that allows me to have a flexible and adaptive supply chain to ensure that the capability that I'm building, right, is sustainable over the life cycle, right?
Yeah, is that what you're trying to say?
Because
Nathaniel?
digital engineering, I see in a couple of Army programs.
Digits will keep the system organized, but I'm actually just asking the system engineering question. Because if you've got good digits,
So
like it'll keep everything lined up.
It will.
But
and
when
so,
you swap out a supplier, change this,
Yes.
you can't get a one-way requirement because everybody wants to sustain the thing that they just shot one way.
Yeah.
And the reason you can't do that is because we can't actually organize the system by any means, digital or otherwise, but we can't organize the systems in an open context. So where is that open, like an open industry system organization structure that actually follows a system?
So wait.
yes. So
yeah,
go
ahead, sir.
to the XM30 at the Army. Colonel Durand, he and the Future Vertical Lift team have been doing digital engineering because we said, hey, you got to design for sustainability and what you're talking about as a system of systems approach, right? Before you even put the first rivet together or whatever it is you're building together. So if you design it like that and you understand, then you're going to have an understanding of where the risks are, who the suppliers are, and where you're going to fail before you deliver the next combat vehicle like the Army did, and then it cancels it 50, 80, $100 million in, right? And so we look down the line, and it even goes further, right? Because the acquisition and community and the operational community are bifurcated. So consumption of parts at the end usually doesn't make it back to the acquisition arm. It only makes it back to the MAGCOM where they're doing the material command level, right? And that's wrong. If I don't know what I'm consuming daily and it doesn't go directly back to the OEMs, that's problematic. If it has to sit for air missile defense at Air Aviation and Missile Command in Huntsville to be curated and looked at by a bunch of, humans, what AI could do, you could send it directly back to the OEM, right? So they could keep their workflow going steady, right? That would reduce cost. It would increase responsiveness. There's a number of things. But, Colonel Durand had done that, and the folks at the Future Vertical Lift cross-functional team are doing things like that. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, anybody else on the panel?
For the guy who asked the question, sir, what's your name and background?
Check. Sorry, thank you. I'm Nathaniel Miller. I'm at NASA for 20 years until Friday, and I got about 30 satellites to space, and I went to manufacturing because I couldn't buy parts.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I think the commercial software industry would be the answer. That's where they do it like that.
They do.
But we've been up here talking about the hard stuff, right? Ships and rivets and all that. So.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think, Nathaniel, as you found, you had to come up with other solutions. I think a lot of times our commercial sector, as you said, Austin, is already in many cases adapted to that. So, yeah, no, good point. Do we have any time for one more question? I think there was one more. I saw, one more question. Sorry.
So, got common ships we're looking at too here. We had an autonomous shipping vessel actually traverse from East Coast to West Coast at Time Out Canal without a crew. That was just by putting a kit inside, a drop-in kit.
You're saying retrofitting an existing
Yeah.
That's right.
vessel?
Exactly.
We go price law, we take advantage of, shipping vessels that are out there right now, we take it,
Yep. Like Nomar or something.
with the drop-in kit,
Yep.
and then continue on as an autonomous.
Yeah.
So we looked at it in great detail. The Navy, to their credit, the first unmanned vessels, I guess not to the Navy's credit, to SCO's credit, excuse me, the first vessels that we made unmanned, ships-wise, they started off as crewed vessels, and we bolted on autonomy. The first American company to achieve like brand recognition outside its space that was doing maritime autonomy, I think, was called Sea Machines. They're up in Boston. They were kind of doing maritime autonomy before it was cool, and their whole thing is we can bolt autonomy onto any vessel. Today, I think for special forces purposes, for creating a lot of disruption, confusion, and let's say solving a like Dunkirk-like scenario, or moving a large vessel into a Chinese port and blowing it up, car bomb style. Those things would be good use cases for bolting on autonomy. However, if I'm making a product and I'm trying to convince someone in the Navy or in the Marine Corps and the Army they should buy it and they should buy more of them, it's got to be really reliable. Reliability for an unmanned ship to go on the open ocean for not just a few weeks, but probably a few months at a time sometimes. Reliability is the number one thing that we have to solve for to make them to get them to yes, right? That's the number one sort of core customer anxiety that I have every day, and I don't blame them one bit. Because the vessel that goes dead or crashes into something in the middle of the Pacific Ocean is going to cause a whole lot of headaches from everyone from the engineers to the general officers all the way up to the politicians and the media, right? So it's got to work. And if you bolt on autonomy, and we can brief y'all on this, like if you bolt on autonomy, you could add filters, you could add oil change, you could add all this other stuff, some redundancy. It's going to work for a little bit, but you're not going to get to 3 nines or much less 5 nines of reliability. This will work for. I don't think you'll even get there for a full month of high reliability, much less the 2 or 3 months that the operators need. And so for any long duration missions, it won't get you there. But I would recommend it for some short duration, tactical effects.
So again, the strategy and how we're going to use it in a layered approach in the right environment, right? You could do those things like AI that will allow humans to get out of the loop for a bit if we just want to routinize it. And there are other places out there doing the drop-in. Right, and it needs to be, it can be autonomous or not at the same, depending on what it's doing, leader, follower, all those kinds of things. Yeah, absolutely. Or manned, right?
Yeah. And Yuta, did you have any additional thoughts?
Like if you look at commercial industry, there are autopilots for large vessels which carries cars or like oils. So there are applications. But as I said at first, if you want to focus on like Taiwan conflict or something, it's better to build vessels which doesn't expect any crews on it. It's way cheaper, smaller to build those vessels. So that's what at least I'm building.
Yeah. So I think with that we're out of time. We're ready to wrap it up here. I think a lot of people got to get on the road. So let's just thank the panelists for their great insight and thoughts, and thank you all for being here.